Hello, I'm Gary Sims from Android Authority. Now, every year when Apple release a new iPhone, they generally release a new processor, a new system on a chip to go with it. And this year has been very much the same. We had the release of the iPhone 8, the iPhone 8 Plus, and the iPhone 10, and all three models are using a new processor from Apple called the Apple A11 Bionic. Now, some initial testing on Geekbench and other benchmarks has shown that this is a really fast processor and seems to be remarkably fast compared to the processors we have in Android. And that raises the question, is it really that fast? Are the benchmarks a good way to measure it? Is it a fair comparison? Well, let me explain. So first of all, a bit about the A11 Bionic. It's a hexa-core processor, means it's got 6 cores. It's based on the ARM 64-bit architecture. It's been designed by Apple in-house, as has the CPU and the GPU that go inside of the SoC. It's got 2 high-performance cores and 4 power efficiency cores. Now, there are some big changes compared to the A10 Fusion, the chip that came before it from Apple. Most significantly, the high-performance cores are up to 25% faster, which is a significant increase. But more importantly, the low-energy cores, the power efficiency cores, are 70% faster than the same cores that you find in the Apple A10. But most significantly, this particular processor can use all 6 cores at the same time. Now, something we've been used to on Android for several years now, but Apple's last processor, the A10, was effectively a dual core processor, or either use the 2 high performance cores or the 2 power efficiency cores. But now all 6 cores can run at the same time in the A11, which is one of the reasons why we're seeing such a big boost in the multi-core scores that we'll talk about in a moment. Now, if we compare the A11 Bionic with the A10 and with a leading Android SoC like the Snapdragon 835, this is what we get. The A11 is now built on the same process technology as the Snapdragon 835, that's 10 nanometers. The A10 Fusion was built on 16 nanometers. We've gone from a quad-core processor which could really only use 2 cores at each time to a hexa-core processor of which it can use all 6 cores at the same time, compared to the Snapdragon 835, which of course is an octa-core processor using 4 high-performance cores and 4 power efficiency cores. And we can see the core scheduling there has changed. It's now per core, which is also what we get on the Snapdragon 835. We've got a 3-core GPU, which Apple aren't telling us very much at all about, in the A11 Bionic, and of course we've got the Adreno 540 in the Snapdragon 835. All 3 chips use the LP, that's low power DDR4 RAM. But of course, when it comes to the benchmarks, this is where we see the major differences. The Snapdragon 835 has a single core score of just under 2,000. That was already being beaten by the A10 Fusion with its 3,339. And now the single core score of the A11 Bionic has jumped up to over 4,000. But the real jump we see here is in the multi-core test, because of course the Snapdragon 835 was beating the A10 Fusion with its score of 6,765 because it had 8 cores which you could all use at the same time. The A10 Fusion was basically a dual core setup, and therefore it was still performing remarkably well, but at 5,386. But look at this now, a doubling from the A10 Fusion to the A11 Bionic. We've gone from 5,000 to 10,000, and that's absolutely 10,000 compared to the 6,000 of the Snapdragon 835. So an absolutely massive increase there. So the first question is, why is the Apple A1011 Bionic, and in fact the A10 Fusion in its generation, why were they so fast? What is Apple's secret? Well, first of all, let's start with a bit of history. Up until 2013, everyone was shipping 32-bit ARM-based cores, and in fact Qualcomm were the leader in that area with their Crate cores, and they really were fast for their time. But in 2013, Apple basically took everybody by surprise by launching a 64-bit processor in the iPhone 5S. Now, that was even before really that even ARM itself, who of course defined the architecture, had products with their 64-bit cores in it. In fact, they weren't expected until 2014. So here we are in late 2013, and Apple have already got a 64-bit processor in their smartphone. And this really did take everybody by surprise. And then over the years that come, Qualcomm tried to battle that. First of all, they released the chip with the Cortex A57 in it. Then they had their own proprietary one, which was the Cryo. And then the Snapdragon 835, we've got this kind of built-on Cortex technology, which is basically, it's understood it's a Cortex A73, but Qualcomm have been allowed to tweak certain things about it to make it a custom CPU. But every time this has been happening, Qualcomm have been, first of all, trying to play catch up, and then they've been going from the ARM one to their own one to the semi-custom one. Apple have year in, year out been releasing a next generation 64-bit CPU, next generation 64-bit CPU, and now the A11 Bionic is the 5th generation CPU that Apple have made. So basically, historically, Apple are 2 generations ahead of everybody else. And that's a significant lead when it comes to processor manufacturing. So they really have got a head start, and they are ahead of the field because of that early head start they had, and everybody else has been trying to play catch up, and they haven't yet caught up with what Apple have been doing. Now that's one part of the story. They had this lead, but there's also other parts of the story. For example, Apple, their entire process is integrated. What I mean by that is the people that are working for Apple design the processors. The people that are building the iPhones work with the people that build the processors. It's a tightly coupled scenario, and everything from the next specifications for the next iPhone and its next processor are discussed all in-house, and they're all done together. Now that's slightly different to the way the rest of the world works, because you've got core designs that are coming from ARM, they're maybe being implemented by Qualcomm or by Huawei or by MediaTek, and then those themselves have to come out and then are shipped in phones. So although these are good cores and they're high performance, there is that lack of tight coupled integration that means that at most Apple can shave some weeks off the development cycle, but also it means maybe that they can tailor their CPUs to be specifically for what they need in those phones, and that gives them an edge, which we'll talk about more in a second, because it means that they're not trying to sell to a general population. And so this is a problem that people like ARM and Qualcomm have. They're trying to sell their chips to a general audience, and that general audience might be a router or a switch maker in a networking scenario. It might be someone who's building something for a television set, or it might be someone who's building something for a smartphone. Now, ARM, therefore, and chip makers like Qualcomm Media produce many variations of their chips with more cores and less cores and more cache and less cache and higher clock frequencies and better GPUs and worse GPUs. And if you just look at the Snapdragon range itself, there are a whole range of processors that Qualcomm make. You know, the 800 series and the 600 series and the 400 series and even the 200 series. They've even got chips that they put inside of wearables. Now, Apple basically make one chip for one product. So that's a very different focus when it comes to what they're doing. But it also allows them to do something that other people like Qualcomm and MediaTek can't do. Apple's chips are basically, I mean, this is rough talk, about twice the size in terms of silicon than everybody else's chips. Now, why is that important? Well, silicon is expensive. So some low-end chip manufacturers would argue that their profit or loss can be found in 1 millimeter squared of silicon. The actual process, that's where their margin is. That's the profit they're going to make on that chip, is whether they can shave off 1 square millimeter from that design. Apple's chips are just double the size of everybody else's. And that means that clearly Apple are putting in a lot of investment into the chip, and they're making cutbacks or design decisions elsewhere in the phone to compensate for that expensive CPU. Now they of course price it as a single unit. They have the design and they have the CPU and they have the screens and the memories and everything else they're going to do, and at the end of it they come up with a price for that screen. Now maybe they can take away bits of profit and loss from other parts of the phone to compensate for such a big CPU. Now ARM and Qualcomm and Samsung and MediaTek can't do that, because ARM need to make a profit, so they make their phone, they make their designs, and they send them off to people like Qualcomm. Qualcomm need to make a profit because they sell those chips to people like Sony and LG and Samsung, and of course then the smartphone maker needs to make a profit, so they have to make money on what they're doing. So at every stage here, you've got people making money on what they're doing, and they've got employees, and they've got pension schemes, and they've got shareholders, and they've got all these things they need to do, and each one of those is adding on their little bit on top. And so that's a different business model, a different way of doing it. Now it works because obviously Android is the most popular mobile operating system in the world. There are some fantastic handsets out there, but it's a different model to what Apple are using. Now there's one more thing worth mentioning. All that extra silicon space is actually in Apple's chips is being given over, a lot of it, to cache size. So for example, up until the A10 Fusion, Apple were using level 3 cache. Now if you don't know what cache memory is. I've got a whole video on about it that I will link here in the description below, but basically main memory on the board, LPDDR4, is slow compared to the speeds that the chip is running at. So it has this cache memory, this intermediate memory, where it can stick values so it can get them quickly without having to go back to main memory, and that speeds up the performance. Now, the more cache memory you've got, that's high speed memory, the faster your processor can go. There are some rules of thumb about, returning diminishing returns, but basically, if you can invest memory there, you're going to get the returns on the performance. Now, Apple chips have been using up until now even level 3 caches of up to 4 megabytes. Now, ARM didn't even support level 3 caches on the Cortex A57, the Cortex A72 and the Cortex A73. It's only now being supported on the Cortex A75, which we haven't yet seen any chips for. And not only were they using big level 3 cache, they're also using big level 2 caches. So you find maybe 2 or 3 megabytes of level 2 caching, whereas on some Android chips you might find that's down to maybe 1 megabyte or something like that, and then no level 3. Of course, each silicon maker, Qualcomm or MediaTek, can decide what they want to do, but the maximums of level 2 cache was only 4 megabytes, and you couldn't get level 3. Now, funnily enough, on the A11 Bionic, Apple have shifted away from a level 3 cache, and they've only got a level 2 cache, of course, and a small level 1 cache, and the level 2 cache is 8 megabytes. So that's a huge amount of level 2 cache that's built in there on the chip. And I'm sure that gives them an advantage, but that's expensive. It's really expensive to make a chip that big. And maybe these chip makers don't have a business model where they can try to sell an OEM like Sony or LG such an expensive processor, whereas Apple can incorporate that in their overall pricing. So if we look at that, there's a history. Apple have got a head start. They really are 2 generations ahead of everybody else because they went to 64-bit earlier than anybody else. There's also because the chips are big, okay, and they've got big amounts of silicon on them, which also includes big amounts of cache, and also because they are the designer and the designer of the chip and the designer of the phone, there is a kind of tight coupling in their process which may be able to help them shave off time of development cycle, which of course in the end means that they're ahead of the game again. Now, does this mean that Android chip makers, Qualcomm and MediaTek and others are never going to catch up? Well, I don't know. I think there is a possibility, of course, that one year maybe Apple will release a bad chip. It didn't go according to plan, the performance increases aren't as good, and that lead that they've got could be reduced. That could happen. It doesn't look like it's going to happen, but that could happen. Secondly, of course, a chip manufacturer like Qualcomm or MediaTek or Samsung can actually produce a chip that is way advanced compared to what they've had, a generational leap. That would also reduce the catch-up that they've got. And also, and probably this is where I'm thinking is really going to happen, we are moving into a kind of a new era of where CPU performance isn't going to be as important as it was before. We've already seen that with GPUs. You'll have a fast GPU, doesn't matter how fast your CPU is. If you've got a bad GPU, you're not going to be getting the graphics performance. But now we're talking into the era of digital assistants, voice recognition, face recognition, and even Apple have got a neural engine. The Kirin 970 has got this neural processing unit. And maybe in the future, we're going to see different parts of the SoC functionality be taken up by different parts of neural network simulations that are going to happen inside the SoC. And if Qualcomm and ARM and MediaTek and Samsung and Huawei can produce processors that lead in that area, that will maybe reduce the lead that Apple have. But kudos to Apple, it is a fast processor, and that's just a fact. There's no point crying about it, there's no point getting upset about it. We should congratulate them for making such a good processor, and then it should be a wake-up call to the people in the Android side to step up their game, because competition is always good. Competition pushes people on to innovate more and to produce better. But having said that, don't think that the Snapdragon 835 or the equivalents from Exynos or the Kirin 970 are somehow sluggers. They are higher performance processors and they do an excellent job. And when you use your smartphone, the user experience will not be diminished by that. But when it comes to raw numbers on paper, the A11 Bionic is faster. It's just a fact. Well, my name is Gary Sim from Android Authority. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let's have a good discussion in the comments below. We don't want any wars, we don't want any nastiness. Let's just talk about the technology, and let's talk about how things are progressing, and let's talk about the benefits to the consumer. Let's talk about why we should applaud any innovation. If you do like this video, please do give it a thumbs up. Please don't forget to subscribe to Android Authority's YouTube channel. Hit that notification bell so that you get sent a message every time there's a new video on the channel. And of course, last but not least, do go over to androidauthority.com, because we are your source for all things Android.